doing deep research, but he has also been living in the region for quite a while. Just let me go through quickly of his bio. Tim Eaton is a research fellow with Chatham House, Middle East and North African program, and was previously project manager for the program's Syria and its Neighborhood Policy Initiative, so with deep knowledge on the issue, which aims to support a coordinated and holistic policy response to the Syrian conflict. His main areas of expertise are the Syrian crisis and its impact on the neighboring countries, media in the Middle East, North African region, and state and society in Libya, another war-torn country for that purpose. Prior to this, he was senior project manager for the Middle East at BBC Media Action Working Group across the Middle Eastern project in Iraq, Egypt, Tunis, and Libya. He has lived in Cairo and Damascus, where he studied and worked for civil society organizations. Tim was awarded the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies Department Scholarship to undertake an MA in Middle East Politics at Exeter University. And he has, written different books, different articles in 2017, several of them, like UN Libya talks have a narrow window to avoid stalemate. In fact, IEMed did a project last year in which we, together with Casa Árabe from Madrid, we built a working group of around 25, 30 experts from the economic sector, researchers, enterprises, international institutions, international financial institutions, in which we tried to put together an analysis, a multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional analysis for what were the situations, especially in Syria, not only in Syria, but especially in Syria, now that things are evolving in another direction, quite different from what they were evolving just 1-2 years ago. So in that sense, we wanted to understand what might be the dynamics that might take place in the region, especially in Syria and the neighboring countries. And he was a key part of that working group, presenting his views and his experience. So that's what he's going to do today. We will have a session where he will present his views, his experience, and then I will open the floor for debate for the students that are here. So I would really appreciate that you ask your doubts, your questions, and make it really a communicative session in which you can really take all the value that this session will have. So thank you very much, and Tim, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Javier, and thank you very much to IEMed for this kind invitation. It's great to be back. I found the meetings we had in 2016 very useful, and so it's really good to come back and sort of look at this again and see what's changed since. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for coming out in the evening and sacrificing your weeknight in January to talk about these issues. I usually get about 5 or 10 minutes to talk at a policy meeting, so I've been presented with an hour, so I'm not quite sure what to do with myself really, but I'll see how I get on. Effectively, what I'm going to do today is try and talk you through a few things. Generally, when we talk about issues of reconstruction and political processes, the way that we cover it in the West is usually from the top down. It's about elites and how they interact. What I'd like to try and do today is present that from the ground up and see what that looks like and how different that might be. And to do so, I'm going to look at it through the lens of war economy analysis. And so I'll start off by talking a little bit about what a war economy is, definitions, and then link that to theories around new wars, and then try and illustrate how that shapes incentive structures within the conflict. I'm going to use Syria and Libya as two similar but different examples of pervasive war economies that I would argue incentivize further conflict. And to do that, I'll try and talk you through how I think those war economies work, their modalities. So in particular, I think that there are 4 different ways, principally, that people profit from them. Selling goods, extracting rents, accessing or controlling central resources, and external patronage. And then once we've kind of got an idea about what that is, I'm going to try and look at 2 specific case studies of efforts to disrupt war economies. I'll look in Libya at the attempts to disrupt human smuggling networks and the impacts that that's had and likely to have in the coming months and years. And then we'll shift on to Syria and Reconstruction, and hopefully once we get to that point, you'll kind of see where I'm coming from, and I'll investigate the question which is being asked in a lot of policy circles, which is, to what extent does the West, or can the West, exert leverage over the Assad regime to fund the reconstruction of Syria. Okay. So, in all simplicity, a war economy is simply an economy in wartime. But when they were first studied, generally they were looked at as centrally planned economies for state-to-state conflict. So that's clearly changed and isn't the case in these two conflicts in question. There's been a lot of work done on West Africa and Somalia and Afghanistan for the growth of war economies, particularly in the early 2000s. And I think what's quite helpful in that work is Jonathan Goodhand, who effectively split the war economy into three. A combat economy, namely the economy where people are directly using funds for violence. A coping economy, where people are using the illicit means or different types of means to effectively subsist. And a shadow economy, which involves all kinds of criminal, illicit, some informal activity, which is basically outside of the formal economy. And what you'll see is those aren't completely separate. They interact, of course, and that provides challenges because you get unintended consequences. You can't just single out a combat economy and remove it. So what options does that give you, and how can you look at it? I would say that the best definition that I've come across of war economies comes from Samar Aboud, who's written an excellent set of works on Syria's war economy, particularly through the lens of business elites. And he describes it as the plurality of economic activity, actors and geographies implicated in the economic conduct and benefit of war. And so linked to that, when we say war, we're not talking about a kind of Clausewitz, state-on-state conflict that has a clear beginning and a clear end. What you notice in conflicts like Syria and Libya is that they're, of course, stocked by varying combinations of state and non-state actors that fight for different reasons in different areas, at different times. And it's logical, therefore, that when we look at Syria and Libya, there's not going to be a point at which you'll be able to say that the conflict stopped. It's going to rumble on in different intensities in different areas. And that's what makes it quite difficult to simply talk about a post-conflict situation, because conflict is likely to be endemic for a long time. Therefore, if you're looking about something like Reconstruction, waiting until there's no conflict, there won't be much left to reconstruct. But really importantly, I think, and helpfully, Mary Koldor's analyses of new wars, she points out that they're not contests of wills, the kind of the Clausewitzian model, but rather they're similar to mutual enterprises. In new wars, the warring parties are interested in the enterprise of war rather than winning or losing. And I think that that's a really important distinction, which tells you a lot about the conflicts in question here. Because I would argue, and I think we'll see, that within war economies, some individuals and groups, their ability to generate revenues and rents depends on the dispensation of violence. And therefore, the removal of violence is actually more of a threat than an opportunity. The problem a lot of the time with the activities that they perpetuate, however, are that they're predatory, they damage the economy, and they're not to any form of mutual benefit. It leads to a lot of asset seizure, etc. But the important thing then is that when you're looking at this through the politics, that these are powerful interests that must be addressed in a political settlement. But without fail, these are people that are never engaged in any international diplomatic efforts. Both in Syria and Libya, these individuals and groups lie completely outside of the structure. So you've got to ask yourself, is that really realistic when you look at the situation on the ground? And of course, the strength of these groups relatively in the two states will have major implications on state building prospects. So I'm sure you guys have got a good idea of what's going on in both the countries, but I thought it'd be just helpful just to run through a bit of a snapshot of where I see them to be. Libya in particular is pretty confusing. Essentially, what we've got in Libya is a disputed peace agreement, the Libyan political agreement, signed in 2015 in December, but not ratified by one of the principal parties. And that basically means that the two rival assemblies that are in existence, the House of Representatives and the High State Council, both claim different legal and legislative arguments for why they should be in power, but don't agree on who should be. over the top of that, the international community hoped that by recognizing a government of national accord, it would be able to establish facts on the ground and bring those parties together. But that hasn't happened. So the government of national accord based in Tripoli effectively is reliant on militias on the ground for its security, and it can't exert its authority even in Tripoli, let alone beyond. At the moment, there is a UN-mandated peace process which has been resuscitated by a new UN special representative. He's got a very optimistic action plan of bringing a three-stage action plan within a year, which seeks to first amend that Libyan political agreement, then hold a constitutional referendum over a new constitution, and then elections, presidential and parliamentary, to move Libya beyond its impasse. But what we're actually seeing is, after 4 or so months of effort, the actors aren't really engaging, and we're just seeing a continuation, an absence of a settlement, and just a status quo continuation. But against that backdrop, we see all of these small actors on the periphery of the country that have a lot of local interests. But the challenge for them is that they don't have enough power to control the whole of the country. So they focus on what's local and immediate and don't look at the bigger picture, which is getting worse. And if you look at the Libyan economy, its foreign currency reserves have come down from something like 109 billion in 2013 to 45 billion today, which means that if it continues at the same rate, the country will be broke by 2022 or 2023, depending on oil sales and oil prices. This is a slightly old map, but it gives you a bit of an idea of the situation. Not that much has changed since this point, to be honest, which tells you a little bit about the status of what's going on. But essentially, the number of colours is misleading, because the green in the east is largely a coalition of groups that are loosely aligned, and the orange in the west is a coalition of groups that aren't aligned at all and have all of their own interests. You have tribal groups in the south. One of the challenges, though, or the ironies, is that you have all of these local actors, but everything has to work nationally through Libya, because it bases 87% of its income off of hydrocarbons, which works on a national basis. Snipping to Syria, which I'm sure you're equally familiar with, but looking at Syria in 2018, where are we? I mean, it seems that the survival of the regime in some form is assured, but it's debatable what remains of that regime and what remains of the state, and what the relationship is between them, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail shortly. Clearly, 2017 was the year where ISIS finally lost its ability to govern. Not to say that it couldn't get it back, but it lost its major strongholds in the country. And the armed opposition really lost all of its international support, and that was critical in its losses. And against that backdrop, we see a kind of resurgent regime, a highly weakened opposition, and effectively, whilst talks continue, the regime isn't negotiating in the same way that it hasn't negotiated to date. So when we were talking in 2016 about what might happen in Reconstruction, we were talking, okay, can we talk post-conflict? No, let's talk post-settlement. Post-settlement has to be the structure. But now we might be talking even without a settlement. So what does that mean for future policy if it just rumbles on and the regime continues to pick off its opponents one by one? Within that, there's a strategy of depopulation, of course. So the regime's calculus is that it has limited capacity and limited number of allies, so it's easier to control territory that has fewer people in it. It's kind of seen as the Chechnya model, which the regime continues to follow, which is also significant when you think of the number of Syrians outside of the country. It's not in the regime's interest for all of those people to return, because it doesn't believe that they'll be loyal to it. And just as a snapshot, these maps are a bit misleading, because, whenever they said ISIS controls half of Syria, most of it was desert. But you can see that they've lost a lot. They lost their territory. You can see the growth of regime-aligned territory, but also significantly in the orange, in the northeast, the growing presence of the YPG, the Syrian People's Units. That's, I think, a big question for policy, which we can come on to later. So with that background then, how do these war economies work? What are they? Well, the first modality is when you sell stuff, goods to sell. And in Syria, a lot's been made of oil smuggling. Of course, there have been a lot of estimates about what it was worth to Islamic State. But I think one of the things that's worth pointing out is that it wasn't Islamic State getting the oil out of the ground. It was the tribes that control the areas that get the oil out of the ground and then pay effectively a rent to IS. And some of the best figures that I've seen suggest that in the height of that extraction, around $2 to $3 million a day of income was generated in Syria's northeast from illegal oil smuggling. And that a quarter of that went to the local tribes, which is significant when you consider that that never would have been the case prior to 2011. These tribes did not have significant political power. And I think the latest World Bank report also suggests that 2 million per day might be roughly about right. But I think one of the things that you hear less about is the cross-line smuggling within Syria. And a case point here is the manipulation of sieges. So if you look at the area of Eastern Ghouta, just on the outskirts of Damascus, it's a particularly powerful example. It was controlled by opposition groups, and it was technically, or it seemed to be under siege, yet a certain amount of goods went in and out. And that's because businessmen, middlemen, were able to pay off either side to make things move and make significant profits along the way. So if you look at one example, Mahiuddin Manfoush, who's known as the Cheese King, which sounds quite innocuous, has probably made tens of millions of dollars at the very least, because if you look at the profits that he was making, buying $500 of sugar and then selling it for $11,250, you can see that that's a pretty good profit margin. He obviously has to pay people off along the way. But basically, what you find is that although Ghouta's under siege, things are available but scarce, it meant that prices of many foodstuff were 24 times what they were in Damascus just down the street. And that's provided a lot of opportunities for businessmen to run those rackets. And indeed, control of the tunnels in and out of Ghouta was one of the principal reasons for the breakdown in relations of armed groups within the area. On the Libyan side of this, I've been doing quite a lot of work on business models around human smuggling. And in 2016, something like 181,000 illegal crossings of the Mediterranean were detected going to Italy, and 162,000 of those started from Libya. Looking at the figures and quite a lot of on-the-ground research, we've kind of assessed that the value of that activity was around $978 million in 2016, which is not an insignificant amount, particularly when you consider that roughly around $300 million of that was generated just in the coastal area where the boats were launched. That's a lot of capital to be generated. But whilst the international discussion is around human smuggling because of its impacts on Europe and Europe's concerns about migration, actually in Libya the bigger concerns about fuel smuggling. And I'm still working on this, but the best assessment I've heard is that fuel smuggling in Libya is worth around $2 billion a year. Just to put that into context, that's something like 6% of Libya's 2015 GDP, with human smuggling something like 3.3%. These are significant amounts of money that generate significant incentives. And as we'll see in the case study a bit later, I think that they bear a lot of closer attention. Very closely linked to selling goods are extracting rents and extortion from usually from controlling territory, but also usually monopolizing force in an area. So if you look at, again, go back to Ghouta, the checkpoint that went into Ghouta was called Al-Hajj al-Million, the million checkpoint, because of the amount of money that was being made through that checkpoint. And it's important to note that it wasn't just the regular army that's controlling it. it was forces aligned to the intelligence services, which tells you a lot about Syria's political economy. And the most recent example I've seen of this, just from a report, was a trader complaining that he was trying to move construction materials into the opposition-held area of Deraa. But at the checkpoint, which was manned or is manned by a regime-aligned force, he's having to pay $400 for each truck that he moves through, just for very basic materials. And that, if you put it together, led the reporter to assume that that checkpoint alone raised something like $2.6 million. And the point here is that that $2.6 million isn't going to Damascus. That remains in the local regime-aligned forces' pockets. And that's significant. But when you add to it that the goods that the guy was shipping are likely to have been granted a monopoly to one businessman by the regime, it means that the people in those areas are reliant on that one person, and you can see how that patronage spreads and allows a lot of wealth accumulation. But I think that what this really links to is, for me, the critical point about this discussion is in Syria, the regime's decision to subcontract. Essentially, knowing its manpower and resource inadequacy, the regime has empowered a group of businessmen and militias around it to support its war effort. In 2013, Assad basically signed off on a law which allowed private businessmen to create militias to protect their capital assets. And if we look, Tobias Schneider's written brilliant stuff on this. I'd recommend you to take a look. Two of the regime's principal attacking units, the Desert Hawks and the Tiger Forces, if you look at their composition, the Tiger Forces effectively came out of a mixture of officers and local smugglers and thugs in Hama who put down the protests. Over time, they've coalesced into an armed force, which is often spearheads regime advances. But there's a lot of reporting from people like Tobias that indicates that they continue to smuggle weapons across line, people, oil, and incredibly quite a lot across ISIS lines in the east of the country. Then if you look at the Desert Hawks, founded by two brothers who had made their money from smuggling oil to Iraq in the 90s, and then capitalizing their money in Latakia on the western coast. These guys effectively made use of the 2013 law to start their force, and have used it also as a cover for money laundering and oil smuggling in and out of Lebanon. These are significant revenues that these guys are generating. And the question is, whilst they're aligned to the regime, they're outside of a chain of command. So they're loyal, but they're also autonomous to a degree. So when we start talking about the future, what does that mean if the state isn't going to have the capacity to rein these guys in? In Libya, you've got an even more decentralized and slightly chaotic system where protection rents are incredibly common. For example, in the human smuggling sector, one stretch of road, there are fewer roads in Libya, so if you control important roads, then you can make a lot of money. One of the roads that goes from Tripoli to the western coastal cities, which is where a lot of the migrants launch, was controlled by an armed group, which would charge 100 Libyan dinars, so about $70 US dollars per migrant that traversed the route. If 181,000 migrants left Libya, clearly not all from those cities, but that's a lot of money over the course of a year. And I've been talking to a lot of businessmen, Libyan businessmen, about these questions. And one particularly well-placed businessman, I said, well, what problems have you had with armed groups? Have you been extorted? How have you dealt with it? And he said, I have. And I said, did you pay? He said, no. And I asked him what the repercussions were. And he said, well, they came to me and they said, we want X amount of dollars to protect your warehouse. He said, no. So they dismantled his whole warehouse and tried to sell it back to him for the price that they'd asked in protection. And that's the kind of, the kind of level that you're working at here. So that's significant. And these practices can also really badly damage the state. So if you look at the East, there was a major oil blockade in 2013, 2014 of the oil crescent. And the National Oil Company estimates that cost the Libya purse $162 billion. The guy that ran it effectively got a payoff from the state of $42 million, which in Libyan terms actually is relatively minor. So there's a lot of money to be made from these activities. Sticking with Libya, I think one of the bits that's least understood is the extent to which war economies focus around the center. With Libya being a highly rentier state, as I said, oil revenues must be distributed centrally. That means that the biggest opportunity is central. And going back to the GNA not having control of the ground in Tripoli. That's allowed a lot of armed groups to extort the state and extort money out of the state. I've been trying to look at this in some detail, and you see some incidents. It might sound insignificant that an armed group controls the Libyan post, but the Libyan post has $7.5 billion in cash reserves and 17,000 salaries. There were examples of hundreds of millions of dollars being taken out of the Libyan post and funneled to one armed group. That probably doesn't number in the thousands. So you can see that getting access to those state resources is significant. Another way is through letters of credit. So letters of credit, everything in Libya is imported. But when you get a letter of credit, it allows you to get foreign currency to buy it from overseas and bring it in. But the Libyan economic collapse has meant that the black market rate is something like 8.5 Libyan dinars to $1. The official rate is 1.4. So if you can buy at the official rate of 1.4 and sell at 8.5, you can see how much money you're going to make. And when you've got tens of millions of dollars in contracts, you can see how that adds up and really badly impacts the state. It's been a way of massive capital flights and moving money out of the country in all kinds of places in Europe. And that's been a real problem. In Syria, going back to what I was talking about before with the subcontracting, it's slightly different, but not that different, because I think it is questionable the extent to which the state can control the people that it's subcontracting. Clearly, there have been examples where the Tiger forces have actually been caught smuggling weapons, and a couple of their guys have been arrested, only to be released a few days later because the regime doesn't have the coercive ability to put down those nominally aligned to it. And one of the interesting things on the regime side, which Samar Aboud has written about extensively, is the growth of new business actors. One of the unintended consequences of the sanctions regime was that as you sanction individuals, the regime can no longer use those guys as a conduit to move things through, so they had to bring in new guys. And that new clique has grown. And so perversely, what you've found is you've got a whole new array of business elites who are completely reliant on their access to state resources and the regime for their income. So what happens to them will be very interesting, because when the regime has tried to entice big financiers back to the country, those individuals already have tried to stop them from coming in. So that's kind of another example of a potential conflict. Oh, I think my clicker's gone. Couldn't get through an hour without a tab.
You can try to.
Where is he?
No, let's try to. Here again, let's try again with the same one.
Okay, I've got it now.
Right.
So the final means of income then is an equally significant one, but one that's tougher to trace and I've done less work on. But clearly, when you look at Libya, it's obvious that there was an external intervention in 2011 which determined the outcome of the Libyan civil war. But even since there have been international agreements and the LPA has been signed, there is a lot of foreign intervention. So particularly, the UN's documented the amount of support that the UAE has been providing to General Haftar in the east in the build-up of the Al Qadim air base. The Emiratis have also moved quite a lot of technicals and other things in clear violation of the UN arms embargo. Stuff's also been funneled through Egypt. But when you look at the East, it's not just that. By last count, there were French, British, American, Italian, Egyptian, Emirati, and Russian special forces all in East Libya. East Libya is not that big a place for that many special forces, so there's a lot going on in that area. In Syria, I should also mention that the Gulf spat, the Emiratis have also accused openly the Qataris and the Turks of supporting their allies on the ground in Libya. And I think from what I can tell at least, there still seems to be a degree of support which is coming, but that's been toned down significantly since 2014 and isn't something which is fundamental to the balance shift. In fact, if you look at the situation on the ground in Libya, those who the Emiratis and the Qataris have backed are losing heavily to their opponents. In Syria, I would argue that the conflict has been determined by the greater support that's been provided to Assad's supporters in comparison to his opponents. And obviously the Russian intervention of 2015 had completely shifted the balance. And the extent of Iranian support for oil provision, militias, and all kinds of things is very significant, and at least $10 billion, I think, at last count. But also it's important to note when we look at the war economy that, of course, the aid money that comes in doesn't go into a vacuum. It's not possible to just put large amounts of money into Syria and expect it to stay with a local project. One of the interesting things here, for example, with the Assad regime, it's been used as a way of funneling money to militias. So armed groups that are loyal to the regime effectively start up an NGO, which is registered by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which then makes it eligible for UN aid and then gets UN money. But there are clear links between some of these individuals. And often the people that make it onto their list make it onto the list because of their relationship with Damascus. In other places, there was a recent report that indicated that money from the British government to the Adam Smith Institute, some of which was diverted to Jabhat al-Nusra, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, Fatah al-Sham, it keeps changing its name, but in Aleppo. And there was kind of consternation in some quarters of the UK. How could UK money end up with Nusra? But if you're going to send a couple £1 million to a small area of Syria that's controlled by that armed group, I think it's almost impossible to believe that none of it would ever end up in that armed group's control, particularly when you're specifying that the people you're supporting are unarmed. Okay, I need to. So that for me then runs through the way that the modalities of the war economies. What I'm going to try and do now is talk a little bit about efforts to disrupt them and successes, or rather failures, of those processes. So what you're seeing in front of you is my social network analysis of Libya's war economy. So what I've been trying to do is illustrate how institutions relate to armed groups and relate to modes of revenue, particularly key nodes like controlling ports, airports, these kinds of things. And so what I'll do is show you, just try and zoom in on one example to try and talk you through it. My presentation thing didn't quite work properly, so bear with me. Right. It's all clear now, right? So effectively what you're seeing is, in purple, those are elements of the state. In red, they're armed groups. The yellow are private enterprises, the green state enterprises, but I won't be talking about them in this case. what I want to talk about is the city of Sabrata, which is one of the principal launch points for illegal crossings of the Mediterranean. In the first few months of 2017, those crossings were on pace to surpass 2016, but all of a sudden, around June, July, they dropped off a cliff and fell by 50% at least in comparison to the previous year, which led people like me to ask why. And what it transpired was that effectively the details are unclear, but this group, the Anas al-Dabashi Brigade, is the one that stopped it. And now there are some connections here which I'll draw, and I'll let you make your own conclusions. But the Anas al-Dabashi Brigade provides the security, or did provide the security, at the Melita Oil Complex, which is run by the Italian firm Eni. And it's worth noting that Eni has a very close relationship to Italian foreign policy. But at the same time, the Anas al-Dabashi Brigade was heavily implicated in the support of human smuggling. But what happened in the opening months of 2017 was that a new group was formed, this 48 Battalion. And the 48 Battalion was created as a new group to combat, basically like a police force within Sabrata, and connected to the Libyan Ministry of Defense. So effectively, this was a state group created to prevent crime, such as human smuggling. But the trick is that the head of the 48 Battalion was Ahmed al-Dabashi's brother. So basically what it was a way of changing the name of an armed group implicated in crimes to a state-sponsored group to provide them funds to stop them from committing crimes, which in a sense sounds like it might work, except for the fact that it basically infringed on everybody else's ability to smuggle, and when that group sought to extend its control, it got targeted by its opposing network in the city called the Anti-Islamic State Operations Room, which is a cunning title. And at this point, there was open fighting in the city of Sabrata, 3,000 people or so, I believe, displaced, 300 buildings destroyed. And what transpired after that fighting, when the Dabashis were ousted from the city, is that they had been effectively kettling large amounts of migrants in illegal detention centres so that they couldn't cross, but they couldn't go anywhere else. And some estimates are that over 10,000 people were just running out of those detention centres. So what does this show us? Well, clearly there are a lot of things that can be criticised on the human rights perspective here. It's not legitimate to promote policies which allow these kinds of groups to illegally detain migrants and abuse them. There's a lot of testimony about people linked to Dabashi and the things that have been done. But I would argue structurally, it also shows you the problem. Because what's happened is, under pressure from the European Union member states, the government of national accord has sought to tackle the problem by paying off one group. But paying off one group doesn't change the economic incentives that underlie that trade, and just creates a bottleneck and creates conflict. So what we've seen is other groups now, after kicking the Dabashis out, come and ask for support. You know, if we're going to give up these kinds of activities, what are you going to give us? And it entrenches this predatory system of payoffs, which doesn't really have an easy escape. And one of the things that's lost in this, I think, is that when you look at the people who are complaining most about the activities that the Italians might have undertaken, and that the GNA definitely did undertake, is that they were the people that were charged with actually stopping these activities, the Department for Countering Illegal Migration, for example. So all of a sudden, the element of the state which you're seeking to improve, to stop these kinds of activities, you've circumnavigated. And how, if you hope to tackle these problems more systemically, is that going to help? I would argue that it won't, but the challenge is that it's delivered that short-term reduction, and it hasn't actually gone up the number of crossings from Sabrata since, which has been seen, particularly in Italy, as a success. But effectively, I would argue, in Libyan terms, it's just made things worse and still hasn't got us any closer to thinking about how to more sustainably tackle these things, you know, providing alternatives to those people who are making money out of it. There are not a lot of other things that people can do in these cities. So I think that that's a problem rather than a solution. Okay. Making good use of the stage here.
Keeping attention.
Yeah. If they're still looking over there, they're asleep. Yeah. So, if that's an example then of a system of payoffs which doesn't really solve a problem but provides a short-term fix, maybe that's an interesting segue into the topic of reconstruction in Syria. And just to recount some of the terrible statistics, the World Bank assesses that Syria's lost 226 billion in GDP from 2011 to 2016, which is something like 4 times its 2010 GDP. 7% of its housing stock destroyed, 20% partially damaged. Between 400 and 470,000 deaths, which is most certainly a conservative underestimate, is clearly more than that. And incredibly, half of its pre-war population forcibly displaced, 6.1 million IDPs, 5.4 million refugees. But I wanted to pick up on one line, or well, one segment from that report, which tells you the more challenging part of the story as well, because it's not just those losses. It's the severely diminished economic connectivity, reduced incentives to produce productive activities, and broken economic and social network and supply chains. When the World Bank calculated the impact of those to reconstruction, they assessed that it was more destructive by a factor of 20. So when you think about reconstruction, it's not just footing the bill for building a building, it's reconstructing those networks and those forms of trust, and that is going to be very challenging. So on the face of it then, it seems quite clear there's a humanitarian incentive, or imperative rather, sorry, to support reconstruction in Syria. Clearly it's terrible, the suffering is unimaginable by almost all measures. And I don't think anybody sits and would ever try and argue with the humanitarian imperative in Western countries for providing support. There are also more cynical political arguments that are made, namely that stabilizing Syria is in the international community's interest. For example, if you don't, what's the alternative? Is it going to, is this going to create a greater incentive for violence for certain groups? Are there going to be more Salafi jihadist movements growing? What will that mean? And also, particularly from the Europeans' cynical perspective, return of refugees. As we've just seen, there's over 5 million refugees, mostly in Europe. So how will they, mostly in the neighboring states and Europe. So how will they, or will they go back? And then finally, it leads you to the quite sensible conclusion when you look and say, okay, if it's going to cost 250 billion, the regime doesn't have 250 billion. If it's going to require these resources and this business, the regime doesn't have those, well then surely the West are the only ones that are going to supply it, because the Russians and the Iranians won't. So can you use that as a card against the regime to extract concessions? But I think when you look at this from the ground up through the lens of the war economy, it doesn't necessarily work out that way, and I'd argue, in fact, it doesn't. So I've already mentioned that, of course, there's unlikely to be a settlement, in my view, and many areas will remain outside of state control. So that's a challenge for classic reconstruction attempts. But most importantly is that the regime seeking to pursue reconstruction in a way that it can control. And I would argue that the West, whilst it's a laudable goal, it's unlikely to be able to win the peace and achieve what it couldn't achieve during the war. That won't work. And that's because the regime defines reconstruction as a means to reconstruct authoritarianism. It's not interested in sacrificing its leverage for investment. And indeed, a couple of months ago in August at the Damascus fair, Assad addressed a large number of expatriate business leaders and told them, we're not going to take any money from the Gulf, no money from the US, none from the West for reconstruction. This is something that we're going to lead thanks to our ability to defeat terrorists with support of Russia and Iran. So the regime realizes that if it got a lot of money in this way, it might have to make concessions. It's not going to do it. One thing that has been consistent throughout the whole Syrian conflict is that the regime hasn't made concessions at the negotiating table. I think I've got a quote from a Syrian analyst called Khadr Khadour, who I would also highly recommend you read. And he says, the regime survived the destruction of the physical and social makeup of Syria, and thereby won leverage to steer the reconstruction effort, control the return of populations, place them in positions of dependency with regard to the state, channel funding through new, loyal intermediaries between Damascus and Syrian cities, and empower new business figures. And I think that, for me, pretty much sums it up. When you combine this with the lengths to which the regime's been willing to go with its depopulation strategy, I think what you'll see is that its reconstruction efforts won't fit the classical mold. It's just going to reinforce and build new networks in areas that it's largely depopulated so that it can maintain control over them, and is incentivized to keep those who don't agree out, which is why places like Idlib, the IDPs and the refugees are particularly integral to this strategy. And if we just look at this through the frame of multilateral international attempts, what we've also seen is that the UN in particular has been unable, when funneling aid through Damascus, to control what happens to it. Damascus has been able to call the shots, which trucks go where, which projects can run, which can't, delaying tactics, all kinds of strategies. And that's been stepped up, particularly now that it's basically agreed that all of that funding needs to go through Damascus. So if that funding's going through Damascus, what control can be retained over it? Our experience to date is very little. On top of that, one of the major developments in the humanitarian sphere was the granting by the UN Security Council of the right for cross-border aid deliveries. And from my understanding, there's a good chance that that comes to an end in 2018. So if that funnel is also removed, then everything starts to come back through Damascus, and that's highly problematic. So that leaves a pretty bleak assessment, because it basically leaves you with a dilemma. Do you effectively support the regime's reconsolidation, or do you practice collective punishment on citizens within regime-held areas? And that is not one I have a good answer for. The policymakers certainly seem to be minded against large-scale reconstruction efforts, but I think that they're waiting to see. I mean, I don't think that there's a great deal of hope in efforts for an international settlement. What we're really just seeing is a slow deterioration of the opposition. There's an interesting report by the Atlantic Council in the last couple of months which basically said, well, look, given these things which I've outlined, you need to look at the local level. You need to focus on areas outside of the regime's control, bolster local capacities. So there, they've suggested focusing on the northeast Kurdish-controlled areas, the Euphrates Shield-held areas in the north, and areas of the south. But then all kinds of other questions arise. If this is really a reconstruction effort, well, what will you support? There's a lot of humanitarian language around different types of things, from early recovery, stabilization, development. And really, I think there's a bit of a muddle here. There's been some good stuff that's been done, but what you also realize is that a lot of the reconstruction that's required in Syria is to national level infrastructure. So what do you do with that? And to what extent is your support in local regions going to remain? Are they just going to be areas that will fall to regime-aligned forces at some stage anyway and be privy to the same concerns that I've outlined? That is also a big question. the northeast, in particular, I think, is where the most questions remain. At Chatham House, we get quite a few policymakers come through who talk to us under the rule. And in 3 years, I've yet to hear anybody explain to me what the US political strategy is towards Syrian Kurds, because I don't think there is one, and I don't think they know, and I don't think this administration is anywhere near as close to the last administration in answering that question. The last administration didn't have an idea either. So that, I think, is a really big question, because if you're looking at areas that are likely to remain outside of regime control, then that is the principal block. And there are a lot of questions to be answered inside those areas. There are a lot of charges of authoritarianism, exclusion, that are leveled at the YPG and its affiliates in that area. And of course, geopolitically, the objections of the Turks, the Iranians, and others to support to the Syrian Kurds will be problematic. But I think the biggest question, for me at least, is to what extent can the regime control the war economy that it's engaged? So it's responded to its threats and its weakness by subcontracting, but has it subcontracted to the extent that it's not going to be able to rein in those subcontractors? And what will that mean for the states? When you hear that Rami Makhlouf, Assad's maternal cousin, may be worth $27 billion, that's a significant amount of sway. To what extent will the regime be able to call the shots? I think that raises a lot of interesting questions that I don't have clear answers to. And finally, on the Iranian front, a lot of this calculus for the regime is dependent on the Iranians continuing to provide the level of support that they are, because without that, then it's going to be much more difficult for the regime to control the ground that it does. So we've seen protests in Iran. You know, is anything on that front likely to change? I would venture no, but this is a significant amount of money that the Iranians are underwriting the regime for that they don't traditionally do. If you look the way that the Iranians generally support non-state actors, it's by getting them to create their own forms of revenue. For example, the revelations with Hezbollah on drugs trafficking, etc. And indeed, Hezbollah manufacture, I believe, quite a lot of amphetamines inside Syria. So just to try and bring that back together then, I would argue that when you look at these conflicts through a lens of a war economy, they are very different, clearly. I would never pretend to say that they're the same, but they do have a lot in common in these modalities. And while the Assad regime has more command and control over its subcontractors than the GNA, it doesn't have a lot. And it doesn't have the coercive capacity to enforce its will. And those subcontractors have their own interests. And that raises a lot of questions for the future. But I think there's a really interesting article by Steve Haderman coming out shortly on some economic orders and civil wars. And he's pointed out that it's not that these civil wars have created entirely new models of revenue. They've just kind of amplified to pre-2011 trends. I think, though, what's important to note is that they've been weaponized through the conflict, which means that there are powerful incentives for the perpetuation of violence, and that is going to be something that's going to be difficult to undo. And so I think Haderman's kind of got it right in his upcoming article that the systems created are likely to reinforce existing trends rather than present an opportunity to establish new ones once a settlement is reached. So that essentially is telling you that there is no liberal peace that is often conceived for a reconstruction whereby there's a settlement, there's a deal, and everybody comes together to make it work. You've seen in Libya, when they tried to make that unity deal, there are too many interests that are divergent and don't depend on central authority. And that is something that's likely to be mirrored in Syria, and is why I think we need to spend more time looking at this from the ground up than pinning our hopes on an internationally mediated settlement.
Okay. Tim, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I think we have learned a lot. Figures, names, tendencies, information from the ground. Unfortunately, we have seen quite a dark scenario.
Sorry.
No, quite a realistically dark scenario, let's say, full of information and insights. So if you allow me first, I would open the floor for the questions for the audience. If not, then also I will have my own questions. Please.
Hello. I'm Karina from Lebanon, actually, so I appreciate all the study that you have done. And I was wondering if Lebanon played any role in when it comes to the borders. And there were a lot of trucks, of course, who were passing and people escaping. So were there any Lebanese officials from the army asking for money? Do you know about that? Because you said that in other Syrian checkpoints within Syria, $500 that they were taking from people from trucks. And my second question, do you think that the international community wasn't it in their interest to destabilize Syria? Because you said it's not in their advantage to have, it's in their advantage to stabilize Syria. So my question is, wasn't it in their advantage in the first place to destabilize this country in order to make money?
Conflict?
Yes. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Is there any question? Yeah, please, here. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. Irene Martinez from CIDOP, another think tank here at Barcelona. So my question is related to Syria as well. I would like to, well, you actually mentioned that Damascus is an independent actor and that it will be able to impose its will in terms of like Western aims at reconstruction. So this is why they're trying to find other ways of like dealing with local actors. So I wonder until which extent does actually Tehran and Moscow have a leverage on Damascus? Because so far, electricity and communications, they have been granted to Tehran. So I mean, Pasdaran and Quds, they already are in the area waiting for their piece of the cake. So until which, like, what is the real leverage of Tehran and Moscow in Damascus? Thank you.
Thanks. Any other question on the floor? No yet. Okay. Thanks.
Lebanon. I don't have any specific information on the Lebanese army, but I have colleagues and know people who travel through, and they do not just travel through. I think there are cuts that need to be paid. I don't think that's specific to the Lebanese army, but I don't have specific information on that. Particularly when you look at the groups that are able to move things through the Lebanese border. As you're aware, that's a pretty porous border, and those kinds of movements of goods and individuals are long-standing. So I don't think that there's even the capacity to enforce that border. The international community spent a lot on the Lebanese National Army to try and do that, but I think in reality, when you look at the underlying political economy of it, this is another problem. You can't just secure a border and stop these things from happening, because that ignores the economic relationships and the power dynamics in those areas. So I would just, that's not a great answer, but I would say that's what I would say about that. Interest in destabilizing Syria prior to 2011. I don't think it's worked out particularly well for the West if that was their aim. My view is that the protests and the events are domestically of domestic origin, and that the West, if it's guilty of anything, I think it was guilty particularly of overestimating its leverage and its ability to impact the situation with a limited amount of support. So that's all I would say on that front. I think that from the analyses that I've seen, the people that I've spoken to, I don't see kind of yet a fear in Syria for the protests. What kind of leverage do Tehran and Moscow have? Well, you point out some very good things about Tehran, right? The deals that they've got, but none of them have been delivered yet, despite the fact that they were promised quite a few months ago. And, you know, it's often simplistically stated that the Russians can deliver Assad, the Iranians can deliver Assad, but what we've seen is that even when the Russians have made certain deals, the regime's not necessarily gone along with it. It has its own interests. It's played the Iranians and the Russians off against each other relatively successfully. And I think that that's something that's likely to do on the economic front as well. But what we have also seen is some significant investments from like the IRGC in Damascus in property, as I understand it, and also in the coast for the Russians and the economic zone. It's just that that will be a very different relationship, I think, than the kind of, I don't think it's anything akin to Reconstruction in that sense. I think what we've seen is that the regime's much keener to empower your Samophors, these kinds of guys for the public-private partnerships and get money in. I think there is a narrative that it's given up a lot of its assets to foreign powers, but I think that that's slightly overplayed. But it will have to give up some because it doesn't have its own. And I think the big challenge for the regime is really, as we saw in the Damascus Fair, to what extent can it convince expatriate Syrian finance to come back? And that's where it's putting in a lot of effort, and where some of the chickens may come home to roost, because some of that capital which it encouraged to leave is being opposed by the new economic order in the country. So I think that would be something important to watch.
I've got my own question. I'm going back to Tehran and Russia in that sense. In fact, what seems to be the outcome of the war is that Damascus regime will continue to be the winning horse, but it wasn't the bet of the West. It was basically the bet of Russia and Iran. So when it comes to reconstruction effort, now we're talking about big money here, Iran is having its own problem at home. Even people are starting to say in the streets, don't send the money to Lebanon, don't send the money to Syria, keep the money here where we need it. Russia seems to be also, well, not having enough money capacity to do so, and they are the supporters of the winning regime. So if they don't have the money, the West is going to put the big money because they have lost in their bet. And Syria doesn't have enough resources at all to do the reconstruction. Where is the money going to come from? Where do you think that the money for the reconstruction that might take years to come can be coming from?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's the analysis, and that's why that makes the argument why Western countries would only provide it, and that the regime needs it, but they'll only provide it in return for concessions. But I think that my point would just be that it won't be a reconstruction in the traditional sense of the word. It's not going to be big ticket items that are reconstructed. It's going to be uneven across the country. It's going to be focused on certain areas. And the regime, if you look at its tactics throughout the war, has had a lot of strategic patience. And I think what it will do is very much take its time, focus on its priorities. And if you look, I think Assad in recent months has also introduced like a 10% reconstruction tax on the Syrian population in regime-held areas. So these aren't people that have got a lot of money to provide in extra taxes, but that tells you a lot about the priorities. So I think that it will be very much a slow burn, not traditional sense reconstruction, but basically rebuilding loyalist networks in new areas. So if you look at Aleppo, as I understand it from Khadur's kind of writings, the new business elites that are kind of coming in are relatively new, but they've got close relationship with the regime. They've been co-opted, and the ones that were there before have effectively been removed. So that's probably a pattern of what we'll see to come, and it won't be even or quick in any sense of the word. But I think that's the way that we've got to look at it. I mean, also, I think we're conditioned to think of an outcome from a conflict, that one side wins or loses or there's a settlement. But I really do think that there's a strong possibility that this just kind of dissipates over a really long period of time, Colombia kind of style.
And as we saw in our working group that we did on reconstruction, it's also a non-classical approach to reconstruction when we are seeing that is war economies, and in certain countries of that country which is in a war, reconstruction starts.
Yeah.
So we can see both at the same time, still war and destruction, reconstruction in some areas, and especially we saw when we talked with the financial instruments that the European Commission has created. So trying to do reconstruction in the so-called liberated areas of the rebels and so on. So the European Commission was starting to do certain reconstruction in the areas out of the control of the regime, while the regime is starting its own reconstruction, and at the same time we are still in a war. So there's a mixture of everything here.
Yeah, and some of that stuff gets blown up. So this is the other thing, right? Because if you, like I said at the beginning, if you wait for all of that fighting to end and then say, okay, we'll commence reconstruction, then there's not much left to reconstruct. The best thinking tells you that you've got to reconstruct what you can, when you can, support markets, to support people. And that's what I think, by and large, the international community has been relatively nuanced in doing over the last couple of years. But then when you start to look at the political outcomes, where you have the reconciliation deals, which are effectively, you know, the people that have been governing those areas bust out of them and pushed into Idlib, more or less, then you can't maintain the outcomes of that support. And I think that's been the problem of a humanitarian policy which isn't backed by a strong political one. And it's very difficult to see, like I say, I mean, how you can, I don't think it's going to be possible for actors like the EU to win the peace in the way that it was kind of hoping it might, to influence the future. And why perhaps the questions about the Northeast become more prominent, because that is where you're going to have a bit more chance to do something lasting. But that will aggravate all kinds of sentiments on ethnic lines. There's obviously a wide argument within the opposition that the YPG would never actually fought, etc., opposed the regime, and that the YPG's actively collaborating with the regime over things now like oil. So a lot of these questions, I think, are very difficult, but certainly it's hard to escape the conclusion that if you are politically aligned with the opposition, then you haven't got anything much out of the international community so far, and therefore you can't hope to get too much support in the future in the form of reconstruction aid.
One last question from my side, which is, out of the more than 5 million refugees that you were mentioning before that basically are in the neighborhood countries, many of them can also be supportive of the regime themselves because they have escaped from the ISIS areas. So that could be also an economic incentive somehow to try to, let me put it bluntly, select from a regime perspective who are the good refugees, to let them come back and be part of the reconstruction, while leave aside the rest that are not on my side, but people that was escaping from the ISIS and eventually other areas that they were supportive of the regime but had to flee. So would it be also another variable that could be in the calculation of the regime to try to bring back these refugees that are my allies or my supporters?
I think it started to offer some routes. I mean, there have been some analyses recently that have indicated, for example, that the consulate in Berlin is facilitating the return of those with asylum status in Germany, for example. Because at the end of the day, family reunification, people miss their country. There are a lot of powerful motivations to return, even if you're not necessarily aligned with the regime. But I think that there are also quite a lot of costs that come along with that you have to pay. And a couple of the anecdotal stories that I read, at least, indicated that particularly military service was on the cards. So those who have been returned...
the real incentive to go back.
No. So, I mean, I take your point that some people certainly have escaped IS-held areas and may not have, may not be completely defined by their opposition to the regime. So it's never uniform. But I would suggest that certainly that's not the majority of that refugee population. Actually, that refugee population is a significant danger to the regime. And there's a lot to be said that the most dangerous time for Assad is if he gets into some kind of when the fighting has more or less come to an end, because that's when the reasons to stick around him become fewer. And I think that's maybe, for the regime, this is also quite a dangerous phase, which is why it's going to be very careful about opening itself up too much.
Thank you very much, Tim. Is there any other question from the audience? No? Any other comment you would like to add? No,
I think I've enough.
Okay, so thank you very much for your session, your views, and your information, your insights. I hope you have enjoyed this session, and thank you very much, Tim, and welcome back whenever you wish. Thank you very much. going to be easier than the soft reconstruction. That means the networks, the new elite, that soft reconstruction that would take, and in building confidence with the people who is next to you from a business perspective in the neighborhoods. Because who are you? Are you a former ISIS? Are you an ally of the regime? Are you so establishing again these soft networks is going to take a long time.
Yeah.
There's deep distrust.
Yeah, the social capital, but I think as well, there have been people that have been trading across the lines that have done quite well. They're going to be in a very good spot right now. I mean, I'm already being told that some of them are kind of diversifying to cement production because they're thinking, if I get into cement,
I will have a big basin there.
yeah.
Unfortunately, that's true. And do you think that the Turks, because we didn't mention about the Turks, do you think they can really play a role? Because the Turks, Erdogan even himself, has been playing, at the beginning he was when he took power, he was an enemy of Syria, they just nearly went to war. Then he was a deep friend of Assad himself, they even went on summer together. Then he became the most relevant enemy of the Assad regime. Then he's tuning down his opposition, and being Erdogan such a political animal, why not finding a kind of status quo where the Turks can also play a role in reconstruction, because they are excellent in reconstruction, they have their own companies, their own financing, which is key.
Obviously, Erdogan's network is construction magnates as well, right? I think
North Iraq, in the Kurdish North Iraq, or in Azerbaijan, or wherever they have been doing jobs. In the Balkans, they have been not only with their companies and know-how in terms of reconstruction, but the state itself was financing, which is the issue that the government doesn't have in Syria. So the Turks are refinancing something that the Turks will be building, so you owe me one.
Yeah, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's only in that Euphrates Shield area, right? And with the Turks, I mean, if the opportunity is going to be in YPG areas, they're not going to do it there. So,
absolutely, no.
So I don't really see, I think the Turks have just lost
their bet.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I see it, but we'll see.
There's a very interesting report on the World Bank called the New Levant in 2014, talking about eventual post-war in the region. That really sounds maybe challenging.
Yeah.
How to really cross reconstruction efforts, infrastructures of integration, energy, roads, water pipelines.
Yeah, I mean,
because they need Lebanon, they need them to go through the region. It's so interconnected. You like it or not, as a regime, as a political option.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. It's just so difficult to see how you navigate. How many people you're going to have to pay off to do that? I mean, that'd be
it's much more
scary.
integrated de facto than North Africa, which is absolutely vertical. There's no integration. But there, Lebanon with Turkey, Syria with Iraq, the minorities, the infrastructures to pipe out oil, water. They will have to be a de facto entente.
Yeah.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, very interesting. These are of our publication.
Oh, thank you.
Of characterised, I don't know if you and your book.
Ah, cool.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Hola, no sé si conoces.
Acá he oído hablar de
Es el último número, la nueva no tienes el último.
Sí, la nueva.
Vale.
Es que entonces con esto se me importa y el anuario. Perfecto.
El último número te lo echaron.
Buen equipo, buena gente, buena gente.
Did I sign out of my that web thing? Did you close the web browser down?
Yes, I closed it.
So,
I'm sorry.
would it be okay just to
Caballero.
double
Yes,
check?
yes, no, yes.
That's,
Cobarde.
I'm sorry.
¿Qué las haces? ¿Qué las haces en la intimidad?
No, quería preguntarle si puede enviar un video sobre el concepto de economía de guerra que tomaba
Nice to meet you.
Sí, sí, pero es una idea.
Middle East research team at FIDO. It's another think tank of international affairs, but I mainly work on Iran right now.
Sí, tío. Porque es una cosa que aquí se ven los grupos que
And I am
interconectan.
so pretty busy. Yeah, I'm pretty busy right now.
Sí, sí, pero Big Data en un contexto de absoluta escasez de datos reales. ¿Quién quiere ser el tío que está allí enviando?
Claro, es que al final la cuestión de la cuadros de todo eso y un punto punto de
some
tan micro.
talks between the Iranian delegation and us.
Pero además, ¿qué información te vas a hacer? Tú puedes, los turistas vienen aquí, consumen dinero y tal, entonces tienes que decir, pero una cosa en la que todo es trueque, todo es en negro porque nadie quiere que sepa, todo es ilegal y opaco. Entonces sacas el dinero y usas
es un punto. Y el
Will be
otro
destroyed,
es,
but the figure of
no te da nombrete, pero
could be changed.
a ver, aquí es donde la política era criminal. Entonces,
But that was more,
o sea,
it was more about if you want some concessions.
Sí.
ahora se ha potenciado.
Ahora se ha gangsterizado y gangsterizado.
Pero ¿cómo funciona? Es decir,
I mean, Iranians
no es
are
que digamos son
Iranians,
democracias
obviously.
con un nivel de corrupción bajo,
But
tal,
at
que
the same
tienen,
time,
digamos,
they
un
of course they
resfriado
have
de
their own
locuras.
agenda.
Es que
And
esto,
it is in their own interest and the interest of the Pastaran to actually get all these contracts
una variable más dentro
in
del proceso
Syria.
de
That's for sure.
distribución
They need
de
it. They are basically choking.
Porque si vas,
The Iranian
digamos,
economy is choking.
desde el punto
So
de
they
vista
do
formal,
need foreign revenue and they cannot have it.
Y es que además, seguramente durante un tiempo es necesario, porque si tú de repente, imagínate, puedes competirlo, decir, compatible, decir, mañana se acaba. Ahí empezó la construcción.
Yes, I mean, it's not even that, it's
que viven de ese
everything,
clientelismo,
international investment,
mañana
everything.
literalmente
So
para
they're
vivir.
basically choking.
Entonces,
And
lo
Donald
que
Trump
tienes que
is
hacer
making
es
a very, very
no
good
prohibirlo, es
They
tackle
know what
the issue.
he's
Dismantling,
definitely
disactivate
getting
it
it.
slowly.
I mean,
Porque si
there's
mañana
so much
pudieras,
uncertainty
porque se
that
acabó.
nobody's investing.
Al revés, tienes una revolución. Y no, es que yo me
And their banks are like outside of any kind of deal with international banks. And they even have these, did you hear about the cargo that on fire?
o en Congo.
They're not
Es
going to
decir,
get
son dos casos de
the
economías
money from
extractivas,
nations. It's not
donde hay una
possible.
variable de
It's not
incentivo